Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the meeting and welcome to those joining us online. Firstly, I'll ask Democratic Services Officer to read out the housekeeping.
Thank you. Please note this meeting is being recorded by the Council for live broadcast and will be published on the Council website for a minimum of 6 months. The meeting may also be recorded or streamed for live or subsequent broadcast by members of the public, although ultimate discretion in this matter lies with the Chair. For those in the room, please note if the fire alarm sounds, please exit the building by way of the nearest available signed fire exit route and make your way to the front of this building, in the front car park of this building. Finally, please ensure background noise is kept to a minimum and mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. For those in the room, this includes turning off microphones and turning the volume down completely on your laptops. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any apologies for this evening?
Thank you. We have apologies from Councillor Stephen Bartlett, Councillor Vicky Slade, Samantha Acton and Lindy Jansen Van Buren. And substitute members, we have Councillor Bernadette Nonovo for Councillor Slade.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Nonovo, for joining. Okay, do any councillors have any disclosable pecuniary interests or any other interest on any items on the agenda? With the caveat that we had this discussion at the beginning of the first Future Places discussion. But if there's anything any councillor wants to note now, please do so. Okay, moving on to confirmation of minutes. We have here the minutes of the last meeting. Thank you to Democratic Services for pulling them together and items that we raised as we went through. Do we have any comments on the minutes? Do we have a mover? Thank you, Councillor Tarling. Do we have a seconder for the minutes? Councillor Waite, thank you. Do we have consensus to agree the minutes? Thank you. Moving on to public issues. May I ask Democratic Services if any public questions, statements or petitions have been submitted in relation to the agenda item?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we have some public questions and statements. The first question is from Ian Redman and is going to be read by Mr. Alex McKinstry.
Thank you. Mr. McKinstry, please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me all right? Okay, jolly good. So, Mr. Ian Redman's question. The core requirement under Section 151 is to ensure that the Council's finances are handled prudently, affordably, sustainably, and lawfully with proper risk management. These duties apply whenever public money is at risk, including when a council lends money to a third party, especially a council-owned company like Future Places. The £8 million working capital loan was approved with no deliverable repayment plan in place, paragraphs 461 to 464. How did the Chief Finance Officer judge this loan to be a prudent, affordable and sustainable loan when Future Places have no guaranteed means to repay it?
The report to Cabinet and Council, 22nd of June 2022 and 12th of July 2022, set out the financial and legal implications in paragraphs 40 to 57. In that report, paragraph 48, it stated, the business plan from Future Places as attached indicates that the £8 million working capital loan facility can be repaid to the Council. The current cash flow indicates the debt will peak as £5.3 million in Q1 2023-24, reducing to nil by the end of 2026-27 financial year. The report also set out the financial risks and stated that there may be future need for provisions to be made for potential losses, although no such provision was being made at that point.
And 3 questions from Mr. McKinstry.
Okay, so first question from me. Part 5.10 of tonight's report considers the £100,000 additional restrictions grant, a type of COVID support grant, which was obtained by Future Places to fund a city identity study. A few details are missing, however. Can you confirm the date of the application for this additional restrictions grant, the identity of whoever it was who signed the application form, and the identity of the Future Places representative who signed the grant acceptance letter of the 8th of December 2021? I'll be content with the job title if it wasn't a senior officer or a councillor signing these documents.
The date of the application was 5th of November 2021. The identity of the applicant was the Future Places Corporate Engagement Director. The identity of the Future Places representative who signed the grant acceptance letter was the Corporate Engagement Director. This was signed on the 8th of December 2021. Please note the terms Strategic Engagement Director and Corporate Engagement Director seem to have been used interchangeably to describe the same post.
I had noticed that, yes, thank you very much, Councillor. OK, question 2. Once awarded, the £100,000 additional restrictions grant was in fact paid to a separate company, 1HQ Limited, who actually carried out the city identity study. However, paragraphs 5, 10, 11 and 5, 10, 13 suggest overspending, and VAT pushed the overall cost of this project up to £128,580, and the excess £28,580 was covered by way of match funding. Where did this match funding derive from? And if it was in fact Future Places who provided the match funding, where did they get the money from?
Although £28,580 was described as match funding, the VAT element of this sum was in fact recoverable. The actual net of VAT spend was £107,150. The net cost of £7,150 above the £100,000 grant was paid for by Future Places and was thus part of the Future Places P&L account for 2021-22. Section 4.1.11 of the investigation report shows this in some more detail. The report also goes on to show that ultimately the council paid for all costs incurred by BCP Future Places, and in this specific case, in 2021-22, from council revenue budgets, i.e. this spend was before the £8 million working capital loan agreement.
OK, and third question. Paragraph 6.3.11 contains the allegation that the shareholder representative, quote, told Future Places executive directors to keep reports in draft to avoid them being subject to freedom of information requests, unquote. If this allegation is true, and as far as I can make out it is only an allegation, it is truly shocking, as it suggests the council's most senior officer then was not only breaching Nolan principles, but encouraging other senior figures to do likewise. For the avoidance of doubt, was the head of audit ever made aware of any such practice? Did it ever come up in corporate management board meetings, for instance, or even in conversation? And as for the maker or makers of the allegation, have they cited any specific examples of this practice or provided any substantiating evidence? If so, can we have the fullest possible details?
The head of Audit and Management Assurance has never heard of this as a deliberate practice or culture to avoid freedom of information requests in BCP Council or predecessor councils. It has never come up in discussions or in corporate management board meetings when the HMA was present. The head of Audit and Management Assurance is not a regular attendee of Corporate Management Board, but as part of the investigation did specifically ask some standing members if it is a practice they have heard or witnessed. The response was this was not a deliberate practice or culture ever heard or witnessed.
Chair, moving on to statements. The first is from Mr. Philip Gattrell, and I'm going to read it out on his behalf. The investigation discloses governance weaknesses due to senior officers' failures. Members must therefore ensure lessons learned are actioned. External audits cannot detect all significant failings, as this resident's public issues have identified over 6 years. But for certain residents' indefatigable input, this matter may have been consigned rapidly to history, notwithstanding consecutive administration's overview. Preceding an information request for Future Places detailed accounts, I also emailed cautionary emphasis regarding statutory documents retention and the Section 77 criminal offence of withholding records. Concerns increased during summer 2024 when information was released inordinately late. Despite senior officers' awareness, an inquiring resident was misinformed at this committee that Future Places management accounts were unavailable following council and company staff departures. That misdirection was withdrawn later at the 17th of October 2024 meeting. My precursory public issue notifying members of the facts was, however, blocked as ineligible. Internal audit clearly require additional resources, enabling the full scope of duties. The next statement is from Mr. Redman. Over to you, Mr. McKinstry.
OK, Mr. Redman writes, when new leadership took office in May 2023, the warning signs were already flashing, yet no full reset was triggered. What was needed was an immediate independent investigation into how a high-risk, high-cost venture had been allowed to operate with weak controls, vague commissioning, and no firm grip on public money. Instead, the council lost more precious years while governance gaps continued and officer-level failings went unchallenged. Political leadership cannot deliver accountability if it accepts assurances at face value. It must insist on evidence, documentation, and compliance with financial regulations. Crucially, the council should have confronted the officer failures that allowed processes to drift, controls to lapse, and public funds to be squandered. The public deserved decisive action in 2023, not delay. As Ian Redmond's statement.
And 3 statements from yourself.
First statement, suggested recommendations read part 510 of tonight's report, additional restrictions grant. That the BCP City panel be investigated by studying email traffic. There can't be too many emails containing the phrase City panel. This was the panel that asked future places to apply for a £100,000 grant for a city identity study, and its members included the Suter Group, CEUTA, whose subsidiary was secretary to 1HQ, the company that ended up doing the study and receiving the grant. That may, of course, be a purely felicitous concatenation of circumstances, but I think it needs looking into. That no councillor or council company sit on any informal reference group, such as the BCP City panel, without this being declared as an other registrable interest. And that no councillor sit on any award-making body, such as the Additional Restrictions Grant Assessment Panel. The optics are terrible. Second statement, regarding the alleged keeping of documents in draft, I'm amazed this is covered in just 25 words. Such a practice would not only have frustrated freedom of information requests, it would also have defeated the council's entire scrutiny regime, as a draft is not classed as a document under the 2012 Access to Information regulations. I'm reminded of Cabinet, 9th of February 2022, where opposition councillors asked to see a budget-related report prepared by KPMG. On the 16th of February, KPMG were asked to update the report in respect of interest rates, and then on the 22nd of February, at full council, the document was said to be in draft and not producible. The committee should seek expert opinion on what a draft document actually comprises and inquire into whether such practices are continuing or continuing covertly. Final statement, looking forward, the committee's identification of recruitment and stewardship as matters for further inquiry is spot on. You'll see from paragraph 591 that the company was seeking yet more stewardship funding, this time from Homes England. Less satisfactory was this committee's discussion of the office premises, which skipped the assertion in 5514 that Drew Mellor certainly knew the director of the rent-receiving company, thanks to a homeless hub project dating back to 2021. Likewise suboptimal was the committee's discussion of bonuses, which ignored the pellucid public statement on this matter and was prefaced with the words, "We're all agreed that some reserved matters didn't have to go to full council." I was aware of no such antecedent concord. I regret, therefore, that in my view, the committee reached entirely the wrong conclusions in these two serious matters of inquiry.
Thank you, Mr McKinstry. So that's all from public statements. Let's move on to the discussion of item 6, BCP Places Future Investigation Report, and continuing the discussion of that report. Now, I understand we finished the last meeting at the start of scope item 5.6, which I have as page 113 out of 214. I'm not sure what the other number that people like to use is. So I'm hoping that we can get through the remainder of the discussion this meeting and allow time for the next steps discussion as well. So we have to get that balance between trying to be prompt in going through it and giving it the attention to detail it deserves. I should note that if committee wants to discuss the confidential appendix, it will be necessary to pass a resolution to exclude the press and public, but we've spoken previously about how limited that appendix is. Unless any members would like to come in at this point, shall we press on with going through the report? So, section 5.6, why did BCP Future Places Limited appoint solicitors to support them on the accounts closure process? I think there's a question here as to whether or not that advice was needed from the insolvency advisor, because as far as I can see, insolvency was not, there was no evidence that insolvency was imminent, so there's a question about whether or not that was needed. But the board felt it was. So did we have any questions on this point? It may be that this is something we can ask in the further questions going out to people, ask for their for their views as to why that decision was taken. Shall we move on? 5.7, did the board provide adequate oversight of the company and its activities at all stages? Again, it's a difficult kind of open question with some judgment, and I think that the Mr. Sannard has reflected that in his comments. So there is an element of judgment there on adequacy, but it's helpful to have that listed in some detail. So we see the detail of the Future Places board minutes. I note Lord Kerslake became chair of the board. He didn't instigate sweeping changes, but he did ask for some small changes. I think it's useful to have this set out as to how this some of this detail. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to highlight a few points with regards to 5.73 and the little snippet that we see of the agenda, because I'm just noting there are 14 agenda items, only 3 of them are actually written reports. Was this the normal sort of standard? Was this how agendas were presented, and were most of the reports like verbal updates? I was also concerned not to see very much on there about the risk register. So I just wanted to ask about that. Thank you.
Mr. Sannard, please.
Thank you. I would say this agenda was not typical, and there tended to be more written than verbal in a typical meeting. And where, for example, it says verbal against the risk register on this, what tended to happen is a risk register was presented at the meeting through a verbal presentation. So in other words, you know, either a PowerPoint or a Word document was shown on the screen to go through at that agenda item to show the risk register as it was at that time.
You have another.
Thank you. Have you seen those presentations? Were they included like within the evidence that you've gathered? Okay, thank you.
Have a sample of files down here where, you know, I could, for example, show you what I've just said in terms of a risk register demonstration.
I think one thing that does strike me is that Lord Kerslake, the chair, when he became chair, did urge, you know, at relation to the 2 governance documents outstanding, so the resource agreement and the commissioning agreement, and obviously sought to try to move those forward. But that's raised elsewhere in the report, as we know about that as something outstanding. And I think it's helpful to note for our discussion later when it comes to the closure. I think at this stage, 5.7.10, it indicates the sort of the beginnings of the relationship within the board becoming more difficult, which I think is comes out from the report as we see throughout throughout the 2023, and some challenges around that. I think it's worth noting that there's some challenges around the published assurance review by the external review by DLUC that was commissioned externally. It was an independent review done, and there were some views around whether or not that gave too negative a view of future places, and so that comes out later. So I think it's helpful to see this timeline. Any more questions on 5.7? Moving on to 5.8. Establish whether any steering groups or advisory groups to BCP Future Places Limited existed. I think, again, we can see some of these that we're aware of already. The Big Plan Delivery Board seem to have been influential. We've spoken about that previously as feeding into the rationale behind Future Places. The relationship with Bournemouth Development Company is noted, but somewhat limited. And I think it's helpful to see in 5.8.8, we can see all of the groups and entities that they had communications with within BCP, but not in a formal way, which I think is useful for some of these areas come up in other work that we see, and it's useful to understand the extent of that relationship with Future Places. Did we have any questions more on this? I know this was an area of particular interest in the discussion around the scope. Trying to understand those relationships. Let's move on to 5.9. Yeah, please, Councillor Phipps.
I'm not sure. Obviously, there's these groups that are there at 5.8.8. That were some of these projects, were they within the remit of Future Places or not?
I think that's a fair question. I mean, I think we've kind of established by now that their remit was quite broad to explore quite a few things. So I could imagine them, a number of organisations being relevant to that. But perhaps, Ms. Sana, did you want to comment on that at all?
I think from my perspective that Future Places would be criticised if they hadn't involved stakeholders that were reasonably obvious in a development, capacity. So things like the bid. You think that Future Places would try to ascertain the views of the business improvement districts. It's just common sense. So there's no group there that I don't think that they stand out as relatively common sense groups that you would want to take the views of if you're working in a development arena. So I think Future Places made sensible decisions in that sense.
Councillor Tarling.
Yeah, Mr. Stan, I was just eating 3 of my 4 sandwiches in that response there, but the other one is, I think that's a very short list for stakeholder engagement on some of the projects. You'd probably expect 3-4 times the amount for a stakeholder engagement list. So the fact that those are engaged with, I think, is fine, absolutely normal. But that isn't the issue of why we close down Future Places. That's part of standard practice on putting a business case together as stakeholder identification and liaison where appropriate at the key stage. So obviously, you don't get anywhere in a planning application if you haven't done a significant amount of stakeholder engagement. It's a very short list. It could be a lot longer. For example, I'm in Holes Bay, for example, you want to engage with the wildlife trusts, RSPB, sailing clubs, you name it. There'll be a whole list of stakeholder engagement there which isn't on there. So, if this is just a sample of what what the stakeholder list is, and it is quite short, but there's nothing wrong with the organisations mentioned there.
Thank you. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting point about the length of the list. Because as we've been going through this, we're aware that quite a lot of money was spent on engagement with a range of different organisations, and that is a very short list. And there's no voluntary sector. I don't see the community, the wider community, reflected on that list either.
Ms. Stannard, you wanted to come in before. Sorry, I missed you.
Yeah. The 5.8, I do use the word included, so it's not an exhaustive list. It's not meant to be. You know, I could have gone on for pages probably, but I would like to draw Councillor Armstrong's attention to 5.8.5, which is a very specific example of community engagement around the Hulls Bay site. So that is a very specific example of community engagement there that Future Places sought to do. And that's an example of, you know, what they did on several, and they also used the word charrettes, you know, and I had to look what the definition of what a charrette was. Yes, thank you. But that's a form of public engagement to get the views of the wider community and groups within the wider community. So that was a concept that Future Places used quite widely.
Thank you. Did you want to come back?
Pardon my, it would be, I don't think we've seen a list of those charrettes. It would be, I don't recall having seen one, because
I understand that was a part of their philosophy, was to hold them, wasn't it? So it's cropped up in a number of their of papers. I wonder if they held some per project, and if we did a piece of work kind of going into a project in detail and seeing everything to do with that project, presumably that is findable, but we've sort of held back on digging into the particular projects, haven't we? I suppose that discussion kind of leads on to 5.9, with similar, unless you wanted to come back in further on that. This is establish the relationships that BCP Future Places Limited had with other bodies, initiatives, companies and council companies and delivery vehicles. So this extends to the professional business relationships, and we have a list on 5.9.1. I think the key point for this section to me that stands out is this relationship with the Bournemouth Development Company over the Winter Gardens, BIC. Now, my understanding is that at some point it was suggested that Future Places might be involved in supporting further ideas for the Winter Gardens site. I think that the idea is that they would be brought in to support. So what does it say? 5.9.10, we agreed Future Places would take the lead on feasibility testing stage whilst there is a pause in the project, as they establish, as Muse/BCP establish position on Winter Gardens. After 5.9.11 says there were viability concerns with the previous scheme. So, I mean, if we could expand on we can go into this. My initial reflections is that, you know, if you have a regeneration company and a plan for Winter Gardens stalls, it's sort of, you can see why it might be suggested that company gives some expertise, some support to the thinking around that. But I think there are some challenges around whether that was originally envisaged. Councillor Phipps.
Let's not ask. Future Places got involved in Winter Gardens, which was a BDC project then. So were they paid for that by BDC? Who paid? Or didn't they get paid? Or what happened?
No, they didn't get paid by BDC, and ultimately the council paid for it, because obviously it was part of the overall cost of the, you know, it's part of the 7.2 million that that Future Places incurred, and therefore we know that eventually the council paid for all of that 7.2 either through outline business cases or through the write-off. So the council paid for that. That
It just seems that if they're doing, you know, they are engaged to do a job or some placemaking or whatever they were doing to this, then it would be, they would send a bill for it and not doesn't just come out of the overdraft and, oh well, you know, where was the like paper trail away on this as to what they actually did and how many hours they spent on it, how much they were charging, and it just come out of the loan, and you know it doesn't seem very good governance at all to me if that is the case.
If it helps, in 5.9.15, the council, when it came to closing Future Places, the work done on BIC/Winter Gardens in progress was considered one of the things that BCP was willing to pay for. Some of it suggesting that they found it useful. So that was paid for directly by BCP upon the closure of Future Places. That was one of the things they said. Well, there's useful work there. But that was commissioned for BCP rather than via. They didn't go between BDC and Future Places. Is that correct?
correct, because you know fundamentally the BDC scheme was significantly different to what Future Places were investigating or understanding whether there was a plausible switch, if you like, from, you know, the plan was basically, is it feasible to switch the BIC to the Winter Garden site and therefore free up the BIC site for something more such as, you know, residential or some other feature.
Yes, a high quality sea facing hotel, I see. So I think the idea is that was explored for BCP, and I suppose the idea would have been that might feed its way back to the BDC discussions at some point. Did anyone want to comment from a Bournemouth Development Company perspective? Or anything further on that, Councillor Tarling?
Councillor Colin, I really admire your persistence and sort of dragging through this. We went through a lot of this already, and I know the reason I'm being quiet is because I got nothing to add from the previous comments that we had on this. So please don't take my silence as the fact I'm not interested, but I've said what I've said about the report at its last presentation, and you know when I went through it yesterday, there's nothing extra substantial. There's no like wow bits added to it. I've gone like, oh, there's something extra been added to it. So it is the report that we saw the draft of, with a few bits and pieces added and a bit of expansion on it. So for my part, I'm not commenting because we've been over a lot of this, and I'd like to skip. And I appreciate you're going to go through it. That's fine. But the reason I'm not commenting is because I'm waiting until we get to the recommendation bit and seeing what we do then. Thank you.
No, thank you, and that's fair. And obviously, I have less comments and questions on this section than I have in previous, because, as I say, a lot of these themes we've talked about before. But I don't want to kind of do the report any disservice. So just rattling through then, 5.10. Any other specific items that may be revealed as a result of the investigation? So the main one here is called out is this the additional restriction grant. Does anyone want to come in on this? I mean, I feel like we have discussed this already, but you know, it is useful to have this set out and this process here. So I think Councillor Tarling.
Yeah, I might actually steal some of Councillor Phipps's sandwich on this one about where the idea came from the city panel, because I know from a Christchurch point of view, most of the residents in Christchurch were very anti the whole city status thing, and you know, was it whose bright idea was it to even go for it and then to apply for money, which potentially, okay, yes, it was a grant, but you know, we have to really apply for grants that we think are worthwhile. For my part, I can't see why it was ever worthwhile looking at the city panel thing, but interested to know where that the kernel or the inception of this came from.
I think that's fair. Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, well, this is, for me, this grant is just absolutely dreadful that this should even have been applied for in the first place and should even have been passed by this council to be agreed to go forward. Amazing. I mean, there were other ones as well, as you know, especially in my ward, that I thought should never have happened, and they definitely shouldn't have. But this one as well. Future places with the applicant. But they didn't do actually the work at all, did they? They sent it out. In fact, there were huge concerns about what was going on with an application in Herne, and I'm chairman of Herne Parish Council, and we had James Croker come to Herne Parish Council. And he was specifically asked a question, and it's minuted. The question was, you know, why was somebody else doing this, not Future Places, and why the consultants had been hired and how much were they being paid. And it was explained by Mr. Croker they couldn't do all the work, and 1HQ were very good at what they did, and they were going to get paid 100k for the lot. I mean, I think it's pretty dire, and I don't think it should ever happen. And I think that's all I can say on it. It's happened, but I think it's dreadful. The way that was organised and that money was just given out, where other companies that really required that money for COVID and were in dire circumstances could have had however many sets of £15,000 there. £100,000 for what? Next to nothing, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, Councillor Armstrong.
Just to echo all of that. And also, I know we've got snippets here, which is really helpful. Thank you, like parts of the application. But were there access to like progress reports? Was there a final grant report submitted? And how is this report that was paid for with £100,000 worth of grant money? How has the report been used? What benefits has it provided to the business community, to BCP as a whole? Because I can't see that.
Thank you.
Certain elements of that question are beyond the scope of this report. You know,
Yeah.
I can't and won't comment on how it was used. You know, that we're going way beyond. Yeah. Can I make one point about the city panel, and you may criticise me for my approach on this, because the city panel for me was a red herring, because, you know, forgive my flippant, you know, if the Prime Minister said, oh, I think this is the council had a board that decided whether the grant, who recommended the bid to that panel is irrelevant in my mind. The council had a board that made the decision, and only they made the decision. They can't hide behind the fact that a city panel recommended it. For me, it was very much a red herring.
Yeah, I think I take that point, that ultimately, you know, all of the various people discussing whether or not to apply for it and everything, that doesn't take away from the fact, and whoever recommended that doesn't take away from the fact that the decision had to be right in and of itself, separate to where the idea came from. But yes, I would have been very concerned if Councillor Broadhead had remained on that panel. So I think it's actually quite reassuring that 5.10.5 that he withdrew from the process. So in that respect, I think that's a positive. But no, I can't say it's a decision that I think was a good use of that funding. I think with this, it's useful to be clear on whether or not we think it's right or fair that they received the funding, versus whether anything went wrong in the process of granting it. And I think that's what we need to be clear about, because I think we can all probably, and again, I shouldn't be paraphrasing what I think we're all saying, but I think we probably all think that maybe with hindsight and with COVID and everything other businesses were going through, this is not where we would have thought that £100,000 might have gone. But whether or not we think that there was something that went wrong in the process, that's different. I'll pause there if I'm not characterising fairly. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. I just want to point out 5.10.5, just for people that might be listening at home, that it was and also get my own understanding. This was a BCP Council Award panel that awarded this grant, that was made up of the Deputy Leader of the Council and 4 officers. Is that correct?
I believe so.
That's correct.
And in granting it, they had to adhere to the guidance that was provided by the government at the time. And there were criteria that they had to speak to against. That's correct, isn't it?
So, and the council had to publish a local scheme, which was on our website at the time, which explained where the council was determining the categories of, so for example, supporting hospitality industry, language schools was another category. So it was all laid out in our policy.
Thank you, Councillor Talley.
Yeah, I think before we get too introspective and staring at our own navel, I mean, we've seen lots of reports in the press over the last few years and post-COVID that there was a lot of these grant monies that were apportioned probably incorrectly, or maybe not incorrectly, but a bit of a waste of the money from central government. And I wouldn't necessarily hold this as a one-off example of it. I expect every local authority around the country has got some example of this. I think you did paraphrase very well and say that it isn't the best use. It isn't potentially what we would have hoped for it, but it wasn't this council's idea to issue this grant, this post-COVID grant money. It was central government as a way to sort of get businesses restarted, and we looking at it now, go like, well, how is this a good use of £100,000? And I think we quite easily see it isn't. But there was lots of other schemes that were just rushed through as a sort of knee-jerk reaction to what was a broken economy after COVID. So, like everything in this report, you look at it, you go like, this is lots of very bad decision making here. Is it illegal? Would it pass a criminal test in court? We think not, and nothing. And I said this the last time we looked at this. There's nothing in this report that says definite criminal activity here. But as Councillor Slade said, it doesn't pass the sniff test on many levels, and it's what we need to do is go through and learn from this. And this is one example. There's loads of examples in this, and it's everything I read, it just makes 100% clear. The first OSB meeting I went to, where we discussed the closing down of future places, I haven't changed my opinion since then, and that was actually before I became elected as a member as well. So I think the press were writing at the time about the money that was being spent and wasted, and then I made a request for the business case on the Civic Centre and the Christchurch Civic Centre, and found that it was pretty poor in quality and standard for the money that was being paid. And my opinion hasn't changed through all these reports that Mr. Sannard has produced. I think this is what we're looking for. I don't see a smoking gun here, but there's definitely other bits that are not right.
Can I just come in with a question of my own? So I looked through the guidance for the scheme, and I felt in my personal assessment, and again, it's only my personal assessment, it was not clear that that grant was inappropriately granted. Now, that's just my assessment from having read the guidance. But I think, to your point, there was a lot of COVID schemes going on. what reassurance was sought from the government that the scheme was in line with the guidance?
I don't know the full answer to that. You know, obviously, the director involved, who was on the panel, was living and breathing this in that time. I've got the guidance in front of me. I've highlighted some key things like, you know, previous guidance for the additional restrictions grant indicate that businesses must have been trading before relevant restrictions were introduced in order to be eligible. This is no longer the case. So it again goes to Councillor Tarling. You know, the government at this time, rightly or wrongly, and some of us think rightly and some of us think wrongly, were pushing money. They were trying to put money into the economy, and this scheme it's not a normal everyday scheme. This was a COVID scheme, and unique circumstances needed unique situations which would never happen in normal life. We wouldn't be dishing grant, and government doesn't dish grants out like this in normal time.
So if this was a standard, you know, if this was a grant scheme that was open now, we would make recommendations around the processing, but it doesn't exist now. And presumably for more mature grants, the guidance is more fleshed out and the criteria are more specified. So Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, I think the guidelines were obviously so loose, it was ridiculous, and I don't think much common sense was applied to some of the allocations of money within this council. You're right in what you say about the sniff test, and it's not the only one. So there is that. But my question here is about, you've just raised the issue that on 5.10.5, the panel did include the deputy leader, who was also a director on the board of Future Places. So how is that not some sort of conflict of interest? How did that happen, and who allowed that to happen in a way? I'm not saying who, but how did it happen? That wasn't right, in my view.
He stepped down from the panel for that decision. So I suppose there's a question about council membership on any grant giving bodies, and I think that might be something for us to make a note on, to come back to, you know, see what's happening now with other grants. But I think I noted at the beginning it was appropriate that he stepped back from that for that decision. So that, you know, the process there doesn't concern me, even if the outcome of it is not what I would have wanted. Sorry, Councillor Andrews, I recall you wanted. Sorry, I missed you.
Thank you. Hearing what Councillor Tom has been saying about the whole shebang, I'm reminded about something. I'm going back actually slightly to paragraph 5.9.6, the bullet point about Westover Road. The charrette sounds like a 1970s pop group, doesn't it? But it's this sort of 3-day thing they had for Westover Road, which I heard about it by reading a press report in the Echo that it had taken place. I queried it with the lead councillor for that, Councillor Nigel Brooks at that time, who I passed on to the senior officers at Future Places, and they said, well, no, the reason is we were inviting occupiers, you know, on Westover Road, trade associations and people from BCP. Because obviously back in 2022, most of Westover Road was empty. The actual owner of the 2 old cinemas there contacted a colleague in my office and said, well, what's this? Why wasn't I invited? The other people that weren't invited were other empty buildings in the town centre, the owners of House of Fraser building, the owners of Beals. Lots of people didn't know about this thing going on. And, you know, they organised this thing and didn't really consider, yes, fine, contacting the people who've got shops still in Westover Road, but and this is mirrored in other things. And the other concern I've got generally about Future Places is that they were given a massive list of things to sort out. And I've said this before, they should have concentrated on 3 or 4 and got those over the line. And then there would have been a positive outcome and we wouldn't have lost circa £2.5 million.
Thank you. I think I had something else I wanted to say on this one, but we can come back to anything we've discussed as and when we wish to, as we move on. So in the interest of moving on, don't let that prevent any questions if anyone wants to come in on anything we've discussed already. So if we talk to the loan interest calculation, it seems to me there was a slight what's the phrase used? Concatenation of circumstances, which meant it was a bit trickier than usual to calculate the interest rate, because there was 2 terms for when it started. Yeah, the execution date. There was some ambiguity about which date that was, and the Bank of England changed base rate in those weeks. I mean, I think the implications of that were small in any context of future places, let alone BCP. But I'm glad it's there and it's clear and it's noted. Are there any consequences to that? Would you have any comments on the kind of materiality of that?
I think I've tried to emphasise at 5.10.20 that the implications for future places is that their P&L account was understated by whichever value you decide to take, depending on your interpretation of the wording. But for the council, the impact was 0, because yes, we would have had in theory an extra interest payment, but at the end of the close down process, we would have had to write off the equal and opposite amount, because what future places paid was ultimately paid for by the council. So there's 0 impact for the council.
Thank you, that's my understanding. I know there was a member of the public who was quite exercised about making sure that was calculated correctly, and I think that is clear. Happy to move on to the next underlined sentence. We're on page 132 now, or of 214. That's action versus authorised. This is a question around what counts as actioning a payment. Sorry, did Councillor Armstrong?
Thank you. The word that I just wanted to not skip over, the ambiguity about the loan payment calculations, because it just seems to me like it's a bit cavalier. It was fortunate that there was no impact on the council, but actually there kind of is. But to not have something that clear in terms of, the percentages and what's actually due and what isn't, I think as a recommendation and as a learning point going forward, we can't have that in any of our agreements.
No, that's fair. I mean, would CFO or someone like to comment on how unusual this is and what we usually do? Was it different to how we would usually do a loan agreement?
I suppose I accept with regards to within this instances there is potentially a level of ambiguity and interpretation. A lot of the contracts that any organisation will get into are very legalistic, and sometimes they can be open to a degree of interpretation and a level of understanding. Clearly, in this instance, the team didn't make the right interpretation at the time, and Nigel's led onto the fact that that didn't have a material impact in the overall position. But I think it's something for everybody to reflect on going forward, to try and get simpler and more straightforward terms within these legal contracts that can be understood by the layperson, let alone anybody with an accountancy degree. And that's what I'd encourage my legal colleagues and my finance colleagues to do and strive for going forward.
I mean, I suppose it's something we could consider as a recommendation. I feel content that that's something that the relevant people are already aware of. But
Yeah, I think the loan agreement has a definition section at the start, and it would be very simple to just add the definition of what we mean by the execution date, and determine whether that's the day it's physically signed or the date it's dated at the top of the document.
Would it be helpful if this was one added to our list of recommendations in terms of as a prompt for that work stream that's already underway? I don't feel strongly, as Mr. Richards has confirmed that that's already in progress. I don't feel strongly, but it's there as an option. Let's take it that Mr. Richards is on top of that and aware of that line of work. Unless anyone says otherwise, please.
Just to be clear, it's not just Mr. Hitchins. It's the finance team, it's the legal team, it's the whole organisation. Because with a lot of these agreements, some of them, you know, they're relevant to a lot of officers, you know, across the organisation, not just the finance and legal team. So I think it's a whole piece of whole organisational learning, not just for one or two bespoke individuals.
That kind of makes me more inclined to think it should be one of our recommendations, and then there's a kind of formal route for it to feed through to across BCP. Are there any reasons not to do that? Let's make that a note to add to the recommendations. Perhaps we can work subsequently when we get to the recommendations, the wording of that. Thank you. Okay, action versus authorise. So this is a question raised by one of the stakeholders that there's a slight difference between who actioned the payment from Future Places versus who signed off on the payment. And does actioning the payment sort of mean who made the decision to sign it off? And then a lot of the actual processing of the payments took place in the BCP finance team because they have the infrastructure and etc. And generally, the person who signs off on the payment is that's the actioning of the payment, because who actually makes it happen is sort of neither here nor there, because nothing would happen without that sign off anyway. Is that correct? Is my understanding, my summary there correct?
Yes, in a large organisation like BCP, it would be perverse for 19 service units to all have their own payment facilities in the good old days, whether that was a checkbook or, you know, it's a central function. And how we exercise that central function is if there's an authorization process, whether it's through purchase orders or invoice sign off, then that's the process. And finance colleagues are literally processing an authorization, not questioning the authorization.
Thank you. I have no further questions on that section if nobody else wants to come in, but thank you for clearing it up. Okay, moving on to section 6. This is Council Oversight, BCP Future Places Limited. Now, this is helpful to have this in one place. In 6.1, we focus on the specific documents: the shareholders agreement, support service agreement, commissioning contract, working loan capital agreement, and lease and license were in place and agreed. And I think we can see here we've talked about this previously, the resource agreement and the commissioning contract. And there's clearly a difference of view as to the reasons for the delay in getting that signed off. Now, my interpretation is that for the first year and a half, when everything was sort of being developed and set up, and there was kind of good faith in that relationship, the draft was sufficient to get things working. But as things became more difficult, it became more of an issue that wasn't completely nailed down. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
It is a fair characterization, but from my perspective as the head of audit and management assurance, I don't know why it was a negotiation process, because the council is the shareholder and the council should have been more forceful and said, this is the way it's happening. And if Future Places colleagues didn't like that, then yes, they can make representation, but ultimately the council is the decision maker, not Future Places. So I think that's where somebody needed to step in and say, enough's enough, this is how it is.
Yeah, I think that's useful reflection. I mean, I have this down as one of the obvious questions to ask some of the stakeholders involved as to, what in your view, and then we can see for ourselves what the competing reasons given were, but it seems there's a bit of it's with them sort of argument. Councillor Phipps.
Just it seems to me to be a clear governance thing, really. That I mean, how can we've got a company like this that we're lending all this money and we don't actually have a signed agreement with them? It seems quite shocking. It was in draft form, and then the resource agreement as well. It says here, okay, maybe it was to start with, but it went on and on and on, and it never ever got signed. So who or what department was responsible for ensuring that there was an agreement, a signed agreement in governance terms? Was it anything to do with this committee? Did anything ever come here? I mean, or was it nothing to do with this committee? Who was it to do with? How did this happen? Because surely it should not have happened, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that there seems to be kind of good wide agreement throughout 2023 that this really needed to be prioritised, and for some reason there seems to have been that negotiation, as Mrs. Samad says. I believe it's related to some of the terms of the risk being taken by the council versus Future Places. I think the Future Places wanted to be paid up front. Is that right? And so yeah, it would be interesting for you to expand a little bit on where do you think would have been the appropriate forum for it to come to get that moved forward. That might be a difficult question, but what could have happened to expedite that?
Just come back on that. So, I just can't see any business, actual business, loaning out money like this without any sort of agreement, written and signed agreement. I just can't see it. So what went wrong? Why did this council do that?
Well, I think I think because of the way they, because of being council owned, I think there was at a working level, it did seem as though there was a, kind of, it says it may be argued that they received the same standards and level of services, in-house services, and it was kind of captured by that the service business plans. So I think it kind of speaks to this blur as to, is it an external company or is it a BCP company? So I think that's fair. Please, Mr.
Can I just double check here my interpretation? I'm reading on the table in section 6.11 that there was a loan agreement, and the loan agreement was signed. We've just had a discussion about the slight ambiguity around one technical term. What wasn't signed was the resource agreement. So it was and I suppose the metaphor that I've got in my mind is, in setting up the company, it's a bit like the kids leaving home. So you set up the company, the kids are originally living with you, and then they gradually move out. But during that time, my sense is that the council was carrying on providing services, and that wasn't fully nailed down, is my interpretation of what this is saying. But gradually, as the business matures and stands on its own 2 feet, eventually it'll have its own finance team, it'll have its own HR team. The kids will have fully left home, be living in their own house. But I think what this is capturing is that moment where the kids are still coming back occasionally. I'm not sure if that metaphor helps, but I think the important point is there was a loan agreement, it was signed, that was fine. It was the support services agreement which wasn't concrete.
Thank you, that's helpful. I think Councillor Tarling first and then Councillor Armstrong.
I gotta say, I absolutely love the metaphor, and I'll take it on to the next stage. Having one kid at university, yes, you are still funding them when they move out, and you hope they're doing the best, but you don't have that control over them, and you hope they're not spending it on new clothes and wild parties and booze and drugs and what have you. But as we find out, some kids do leave home, and as we find, spend the money inappropriately on drugs and partying. So thank you very much for the course, metaphorically is what I'm saying, exactly.
Thank you. No, I think that's helpful to clarify that the loan agreement itself was signed. It's that subsequent the relation the resourcing that you can understand why the argument for developing it over time, even if I would disagree with that approach. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. It's just continuing that point. Again, referring to the table in 6.1.1 and the comment in 6.1.2, I think it's really important to be clear that it was an aspiration, which again, I don't understand why you wouldn't have a resource agreement that's there to set out what all the formal arrangements are about the terms and conditions for costing, for charging, things like that, and also a commissioning contract. And we know from the previous discussions that there were tensions between the council commissioning team and also Future Places commissioning team. Now that could have all have been avoided potentially if there was proper clarity, if there's a proper framework drawn up to enable those two functions to operate. And also, I'm wondering, were there any council officers at all, or any of the Future Places staff who came to meetings and provided assurances that those documents were in place?
Do you want to come in at that point, or did you want to give any comments on that? Yeah, because let's discuss them together.
Apparently there was, I understand there was a council officer that did come in to audit and governance, as I understand it. I think it was in March 2022. Sarah Longthorpe, who said that resource agreements were already in place. I believe this committee was told that, but it does seem as though they weren't.
So, in answer to your initial question about why was it not all done and sorted, I suppose this is a parallel to the discussion about the governance and why did they not have executive directors in place from the start? Why were there councillors on the board? And the argument is the same, which is to try to get things moving and get it set up at pace, and then work out some of these details as they went along, rather than have everything as it should be from day one, which obviously would have meant pushing it forward. Now you know what my instinctive preference there, but I think it's the same. It's that same desire to get things moving. Do you think that's fair?
Yes, it is. And the just to be clear on the commissioning contract, that is basically the document, and the key feature of that document is when will the council pay Future Places at what points? And obviously that happened in practice. It happened. The council paid them at the point of an outline business case. That was in the draft. You know, everybody sort of so reality happened, even though that document didn't exist as final. And Councillor Armstrong's right. That is, you know, because it wasn't agreed from both. That's why some of the tensions started to appear. Absolutely the case. And the big issue was at the point of after outline business cases were approved by the council, and in other words, the period between outline business case and final business case, there's an awful lot of additional costs that are incurred, and the council wanted to pay Future Places at the point of the final business case, and Future Places wanted stage payments because the risk of financing that what could be a significant sum. You know, we've seen there's a couple of tables in the report elsewhere where, you know, outline business cases, full business cases are millions of pounds, not hundreds of thousands in some of the big schemes. So for Future Places to have to finance the cash flow of £1 million, you know, it's tricky for them when the working capital loan's 8 million.
Thank you, Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you for letting me come back on that. I just again want to point out that with regards to those two agreements, the resource agreement and the commissioning contract, the comment in the report is appears to exist in draft form only and not formally agreed or signed. And we are talking about millions of pounds here. I also would like, as a question, I'd like to clarify what's meant here by draft form, given the statement actually that Mr. McKinstry, from Member of the Public, made earlier. So what assurances can we provide? Why were there so many documents in draft form? I can understand that if you're working on something, you'd keep something as a draft. But for the whole life of this programme, there seem to be so many draft documents. Why? Why is that?
I just come in on that. I just wanted to caveat that comment about being told to keep things in draft, that is an unsubstantiated accusation, and I just want to be clear on that. And I'm aware of one person so far making that accusation. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be taking it seriously and the implications for that, but I just want to kind of give that context that we haven't had corroboration of that. But I think generally we have seen lots of draft documents, and I imagine you would with something like this. But do you think it being in draft was an issue here for getting that for that process, or was it something that was
It's a very
difficult
simple
to find?
explanation why it was draft. It was not agreed by both parties, and what I said earlier is there should have been a point when the council said this is not a negotiation, this is how it is, and we just didn't get to that point, and we just faffed around trying to negotiate a position, and we couldn't negotiate a position, and somebody should have got a grip and just said enough's enough, this is how it is.
Were there any consequences of this? Because as you say, the payments were made appropriately for the work done, as if it had been signed. Were there any consequences of this, of them not having been finalised, other than, as Councillor Armstrong has mentioned, the kind of potentially predictable tension it might make at a working level?
Well, from Future Place, I can't speak for Future, but Future Places may have said, for example, that the council's charging us 120 grand or there or thereabouts for support services that we've not approved because we don't know. The council's just forcing that on us because there isn't a schedule attached and there isn't what are we getting for that, and so on and so forth. So that might be their stance.
Did you want to come in, Councillor Phipps?
As far as drafts are concerned, there were so many, as you said.
Yeah.
Why was everything just left in draft, and they were kind of operating in drafts? Apparently, in Holmes, there's a Freedom of Information last year that I think a lot of us are aware of. And of the Holmes Bay reports, 21 out of 27 were in draft. Why? Why were all these drafts? Why was nothing ever confirmed?
Well, some outline business cases were confirmed and came to council, but did you want to comment on that? I mean, personally, I think I take a different view to some on this, because I think my experience of big organisations, when you want to have lots of input on a document, or particularly on a large document, you do not. It is in draft until it's had a fairly senior level of approval to it. You can't have things going for decision when they've only been looked at by the intern. So I think that there's a difference of views here as to what we're talking about draft. Now, I know this is something that this is a kind of a concern about whether this is prevalent and whether there's more of this. I think we should we should consider whether or not that's something we can ask for it to be looked into further, and we can kind of come back to that. But I'm not seeing anything concerning about these contracts being in draft until they're signed by both parties. Right? That doesn't strike me as unusual there. Councillor Armstrong.
Okay, so it's moving slightly on, but still keeping the draft theme. On 6.3.11 on page 141, it is mentioned about keeping reports in draft to avoid them being subject to freedom of information requests. So it does actually put that. Perhaps we need to clarify exactly who said that. Was it actually said? Was that the instructions that were given to officers? It's not entirely clear.
So that's the point. That's what I've referred to as that's the one instance I'm aware of that accusation. Now, other councillors and others might have experience of elsewhere that being a concern. But that is the only accusation of that being a feature for future places that I'm aware of, and it hasn't been confirmed or corroborated by anyone, including the person who's accused to have said it. So I think that's one to put on our list of questions to put to people, but I wouldn't want to give it more weight without being substantiated until then. But the theme generally is one for us to be taking seriously. Yes. So, yeah.
If I can just come in to refine the question a little, because my understanding of the Freedom of Information Act is that just because the document is draft doesn't mean it's exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. What it means, or the reason not to publish it, is because it's going to be published in the future. So if it's going to be finished in 3 weeks' time, we don't publish it today. So that's the argument, that a draft document that's going to be published in 3 weeks in the near future can be exempt, but just because it's got draft stamped on it doesn't mean it is exempt. So I wonder if there's, in terms of a refinement, if we could have if we as officers go away and clarify that accuracy, and it would help kind of perhaps take some of the heat out of this particular issue.
I think that's helpful. I think we should get confirmation on the specific accusations, because, as you say, if true, then very concerning. But again, unsubstantiated so far. I think there might be some merit in it, in some exploration of how well it's understood across BCP, what counts as draft, and what's a reasonable point at which something stops becoming draft. And that might be something for further exploration. Susanna.
Can I also just refer back to, I think it was Mr. McKinstry's question, or Mr. McKinstry definitely read it out, and we definitely gave the answer that it's not a culture that I recognise, and it's not a culture that when I asked other people on the corporate management board, is it a culture that prevails in BCP Council where let's have the ruse of keeping things in draft to avoid FOIs, and it's just not a thing we've ever heard of. So, you know. Yeah.
Let's pick that up as one of the themes that we're taking seriously, but want to substantiate. So I am happy to move on the point of the commissioning contract and resource agreement. I'm glad that there are some strong recommendations about that for future. And the reasons for the delay is one of the themes I've got on the list of questions we can ask. Happy to move on to is this 6.2 or still 6.1?
No, still on the table. It was just to, and I know we've discussed this previously actually, so I'm not going to harp on about it, but just the fact that there was no such agreement in place for lease or licensing to occupy council premises by Future Places Limited either.
Yeah, we talked about that previously, didn't we? And that they worked from here for a period of time before deciding that they wanted to move elsewhere. Okay, 6.2, role of shareholder representative on BCP Future Places Limited board. Again, I think useful. There's a recommendation on this, on giving that clearer definition. You've quite amply set out evidence of the role of that shareholder representative. I can't say I have any questions on this section. I mean, all of it you could question in detail, or you could keep going indefinitely, but nothing jumps out in that section to me. Did anybody want to, other than what we've already raised previously, but Councillor Armstrong?
One thing that jumps out for me is that at that time the council chooses not to have internal or individual service level agreements between council services. I'm just wondering why that is, why that's continuing, or if it is continuing.
The simple explanation is that it's a waste of resource, and we're playing internal shops. By having a more strategic document set out in a service plan, that service plan articulates what service is being provided. You know, I use the finance service plan as an example. So in there, it sets out what accountancy does, what audit and management assurance does, what other teams in finance do, and to say that, you know, oh, we agreed to charge planning £6,000 and we have a service level agreement, it's just wasting resource.
Sorry. 6.3, should we discuss? Was the shareholder agreement adhered to? Are there any examples of where it was breached or information not provided? Again, I think that the key issue here for me is that tighter control on reserved matters. And there's this question about whether approved by council, what that means. And I didn't intend to be flippant in the previous meeting to discuss this. I hope I was just trying to reflect again, sum up what I understood to be views of committee members, which was just that it's clearly there's a judgment there as to which reserved matters automatically went to full council and which did not. And there's some sort of scale there of reserved matters. That was the only point I meant to make. Apologies if I was summing up too brusquely after what, 8-9 hours of future places chairing. So I'm pleased with the recommendations on this section. I think that they're very strong ones. So thank you. Did anybody want to come in on this section? I should mention on this question of bonuses. I'm aware that the external auditor approves very much the recommendations and thinks that they're all strong, robust ones. And one comment that he made when I last spoke to him was for things that are novel and different and not usually what BCP would be doing. They're the things that would stand out as kind of needing that challenge as to whether or not we would want to flag them. And I think that's the general lesson for future places, because it was new and different, and bonuses are not usually something that we would do. So that there kind of needs to be that extra consideration around the process for doing something novel, which I imagine we would all agree with. Did anybody want to come in on 6.3? Again, I feel a lot of the items here we've already touched on and we can come back to. 6.4, consider the adequacy of the role of the council's internal audit team, with the helpful caveat at the beginning that we wouldn't be expecting you to kind of critique your own role, but I think nevertheless it's helpful to have it set out, the action taken. And I think that is useful and clear. And I think we need to remember that it was only running for how many months was it?
26 months. You were restricted for that month.
And I think useful for that discussion we had at our last meeting about, you know, internal audit being backward looking, and at what point should something kind of more live be looked at, and what's a reasonable expectation there is useful. And I think what struck me as well is the future places peak expenditure was, I think, 0.3% of BCP's expenditure for 23-24. I think that's a useful context as well, because I think while it's really important that we learn the lessons from future places, that is a useful context when you're looking at entire functions. Councillor Tarley.
I think it's worth noting that the purpose of having an arm's length or a special purpose company is to take it out of the reach of some of the more council-based sort of functions, and the audit and governance is really done by the shareholders, which is the council as a sort of body corporate, and not necessarily the individual functions unless specifically requested. And as far as I know, that wasn't actually requested during the period of it running. It's obviously prior to my tenure as a member of this council. But, you know, I wouldn't expect, you made a good point about it, you know, it being backward looking, but the company hadn't really got going to a point where you have something that you'd really want to audit, and as I said, it's an arm's length company. It's there for that purpose, so that you know, we don't apply all the normal functions like HR, audit, you know, finance at the officer level. You're applying it at a strategic governance level, and that's the reason behind it. So, you know, I wouldn't expect a detailed audit unless it had been specifically requested by this committee at the time.
Which we could ask people from that committee at the time as part of our going out to ask for recollections of the period. Mrs. Sana, did you want to come?
In the spirit of being totally open and transparent here, the council stipulated that internal audit would be involved in Future Places. So thus we were in the resource agreement, thus Future Places paid internal audit for a small, you know, you'll see later in this section, you know, we basically did 21 days over the life of BCP Future Places over the 2 and a bit years, and we got paid £9,300 for that. And what not 6.4 does lays out what we did for that, and yes, it was more of a service to the council than Future Places, but there were elements certainly in the entity review that we did for, you know, to comply with best practice. There's benefits to Future Places there.
Thank you. Councillor Armstrong.
Yeah, it's just a comment really. I mean, as it was a TECL company, so it's benefiting from contracts for work, services and supplying from its controlling contracting authority, which is BCP, without necessarily having to go through competitive tender processes. We've already seen that some of the benefits that it received, including being able to occupy council premises without having a lease in place. So I'd say, although I acknowledge that it was a new entity setting up, I think that actually I would feel that it would need to be properly, you know, properly overseen, and acknowledgement of all those benefits that it was receiving.
When you say properly overseen,
well, we're acknowledging that the governance frameworks weren't in place to be able to oversee it. We've discussed that.
so we know that they didn't have the kind of their planned governance structure because they wanted to to hire the non-executive directors, and that took a number of months. So that took time, and they put the councillors on the board until they recruited them. Is that the fact that there were councillors on the board? Is that the bit that you're referring to there? I'm not sure about what the governance structures bit was, because I think we should explore it.
Sorry, we were talking about audit and audit resource, and what prompted me to make the comment that I did was thinking that as a TECL company that was benefiting so much and was able to, sorry, where was I'm knocking, what's that? Okay, is someone trying to speak from the sorry, I've lost my train of thought now.
It should have kind of been more in line for more scrutiny from the start.
That's the point that I'm trying to make.
So I think I agree, but I think that I would have thought that internal audit should have looked at the framework, and that's like the risk management. You know, we were talking about the first, second, third line. I think internal audit should have been looking at that framework and how well that was operating, but that was still being set up, I suppose, for the first year. It has to be running to be audited, if that makes sense. So I suppose there's a role there on kind of a watching, you know, as it unfolds, but it's almost like you can't go in too early and make comments while it's being worked through. I'm not putting that very well, but do you know what I'm trying to say there?
Perhaps if I refer Councillor Armstrong to my paragraph 6.410, what that bit of work was is looking at the policies that BCP Future Places effectively had off the shelf from Purple HR. So things like their qualities, their recruitment policy, 20 odd policies. There's a list elsewhere in the report at 3.3.3. So I reviewed those, and knowing that those policies existed gave me comfort, and part of the risk assessment around what. But then Councillor Connolly's exactly right. They've got to actually run for a period of time, because yes, the policies existed. The next question, bit down the line, was, and are they following those policies? But we never actually got to that point, because by then the entity was shutting down, and so yeah, that's the.
I wonder if there's a. Sorry, Councillor.
Was at what point was Future Places occurring in the audit and governance universe? Had it come into that bigger picture at the time it was being created, or did it come in much later?
From day one, it's part of our overall risk assessment, and we talked about risks at the last Audit and Governance Committee around how we assess whether we're going to look at something or not with scarce resource, and part of that risk assessment in this particular example was reviewing those policies and reviewing the compliance with best practice set out in this. So we were starting at the front end. Are the governance documents in place? Are there, so following best practice? Are there the suitable policies in place? So we had the answers to that in the work we did.
So you did do they have the obvious stuff? You did that work straight away, and then the plan was to give it time to see if they were being followed and it was working, and then audit it, but you never got to that stage because it got closed down before you would have, in the natural course of events, put it into the forward plan. And we talked about this at the last meeting about how audit and governance could always have said, can we have can you bring forward and do some sort of update on like an interim view or something, kind of like we're doing for Carter's Quay. We're saying we know it's a live issue, but you could still do something. But again, they may have come to the same conclusion as well. Let's give it some time to see if it's working first. I wonder, and I haven't thought this through very well, I wonder if there's a recommendation in the space for kind of new project or new or novel pieces of work that BCP is doing. There's kind of an automatic trigger to flag in the forward plan discussion at A&G that you're aware of this potential future area of work and the reasons why you're not looking at it. Yeah, you would think it appropriate to look at it and give that kind of a comment on that. So you could give an update as to when the appropriate time to look at something might be. For the benefit of audit and governance. I think I worry that might be too specific to this, but interested in what others think. Phipps.
I mean, can we sort of be told where? It's not overly clear really to me where the oversight actually was in all of this with regards to the risk, I suppose. I mean, this was going to be, there was a lot of money going out, and a lot of it seemed to be spent on staff and consultancies. We've already discussed this consultancy issue. They were paid, some of them were paid quite a lot of money. Over the time, there was a lot of staff. I can't remember how many, but I remember seeing the lists of staff number 1, 2, 3, and it was a lot of staff, and the consultancies as well. And were we getting the output or what was coming back for that? A lot of the projects didn't seem to get very far. They all seemed to be in some sort of part or draft form or whatever. So, where were the frameworks, the concepts and that? So what was coming, who was looking at all this as to where this was actually going? Because we didn't seem to get much out of it by the end of it as far as an outcome, except a lot of money being spent all over the place, and obviously risks. There was risk involved, so presumably, did we have risk strategies on this? I can't. You know, we presumably did, and can you give me some? You know, who was looking at it? Where was the oversight on all this? Just general terms, perhaps you could just say. Thank you.
Did you want to come in on
Well,
that?
I'll use the
what was in the second one?
three-line defence model. So first line defence is the executive directors of Future Places. So they're the first line defence in terms of making sure they're doing what the council. Second line defence is effectively the board. So the council had a shareholder representative on the board, the independent non-execs ultimately, albeit a year and a little bit in. So they have the role, second line defence role, and then obviously internal audit being the third line defence. So, and obviously the board then agreed lots of the things you were talking about. So they reviewed the procurement, they reviewed the recruitment, you know, who's being appointed on it. You know, it's quite often every board meeting had an update on we're recruiting to this, we're recruiting to that. This person's left, you know. So just as an example, likewise on procurement, this is the schedule of procurements that we've entered into since the last board meeting. So there's a lot of in-depth review at the board meeting around this, and then periodically there was the annual report that went to full council, cabinet. So Future Places there ultimately gave an annual report on this is what the council has asked us to do, this is what we've done so far, and that went to cabinet.
Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, we're saying the directors, the board, and so the three representatives that we had on the board, one was the shareholder representative and the two councillors, basically ultimately were the oversight pretty much on the day-to-day running of that company as far as BCP Council was concerned. And then you're saying there was an annual report to cabinet that didn't come to full council that I'm aware of for any sort of ratification, just went to cabinet as a report. So on a day-to-day basis, we had three representatives on there, the shareholder representative and two councillors. Is that correct? They were our representatives as far as this council is concerned, and that was it?
At first, and then the two councillors were replaced by non-executive directors. So the idea was
we didn't have a lot of oversight in a way.
Well, I think the model was it was supposed to be as if it was a separate company, in which case it would have its own standalone governance and the board structure and risk management, and that it was just the shareholder representative was the link. But then I think what you're talking about is the oversight of what's happening for the money. So what's the oversight of BCP Council end? So I think you've got the Future Places oversight and processes, and that seems to be relatively typical of a standalone company, if early. But what you're talking about is the oversight within BCP Council for the kind of the loan, right? The investment, what the monitoring of what we're likely to get back for that investment, and that's a slightly different question, because you wouldn't necessarily expect that to be the day-to-day working level monitoring of as you would within if it was in your own organisation. You're talking about that challenge as to the progress against the loan, and I think it's that update to cabinet was it. I think that does that make sense?
But it was annual. It was once a year, and it wasn't enough in my view.
But do you think, as a recommendation, would you say that for a sizable investment of this kind, you would think that there should be closer monitoring of the returns for the money than because I think there's one thing talking about Future Places is risk management, and that's that. But what we're talking about is the BCP oversight of what's the prospects of that money, and I think that's slightly different. And because we do have other loan agreements, so maybe there's a recommendation there around whether annual is enough for something of that scale. But again, maybe it's so specific. What others think? Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, Chair. And I think here lies like some of the confusion. I'm glad you mentioned the model of like the first, second and third line of defence. because when you just, and I know we've already discussed this particular section, but in 5.3.4, we're talking about the report is telling us that councillors were too involved in their day-to-day operations and the commissioning activity. So it's, yeah, where's the balance to be struck here? And which councillors are we talking about? Are we talking about Cabinet? Because we've just heard that Cabinet got an annual report. Are we talking about the councillors that were on the board in the second line of defence, or as the company directors in the first line? I just think I'd like a bit of clarity around that.
My
Thank you.
understanding is that speaks to the separate problem, which was what we talked about how the councillors sat on the board until they could hire the NEDs, and there was a feeling that they were not acting as necessarily board members, but maybe more in the operational side, and that was the concern. And I remember Councillor Broadhead saying, "Well, to be fair, we knew we were only there temporarily to be replaced." But I think that's what that's referring to. Am I right? In terms of it was the councillors on the board were being more involved than perhaps expected of board members at that time. But that was intended to be temporary. That's my understanding. Is that? Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So I think there's the governance within Future Places question, and then there's the governance within BCP of our investment question. And I think they're both they're slightly separate but linked. But I think that you're right that there was too much councillor involvement within Future Places, according to some of the reviews done, but maybe not enough councillor involvement at that challenge from within BCP on progress against it. So it's almost like the wrong kind, the wrong time or the wrong. Okay, well, I'm happy with those recommendations, but I think that there is a big lesson there about, for a sizable investment in a project, councillors might want more than annual updates on how it's going. But then it kind of comes back to that what we talked about about the beginning, about the idea was to let it go off and see what it can produce. And it's almost like they took that was part of the risk taken on in deciding to do it, was you wouldn't have that close oversight. Councillor Phipps.
Are you saying that a recommendation from this on 6.4 would be that, in the future there would be more BCP oversight in this type of, not that we're necessarily going to have another tech or company, but this type of venture or something, the same sort of, a company that was part of us, or we need, I think there wasn't enough oversight generally in a bigger way, not just the day-to-day running from the directors.
I mean, just from my view, I think that is a sensible recommendation, but I guess it would depend on the project being undertaken, and that's what Cabinet agreed at its at that initial, when it signed off the what's it called? I'm forgetting the terms. When it basically signed off on the idea for Future Places, that was the point at which full council agreed to that model, and I think that part of the proposal was that arm's length. That was kind of the attraction, was that you wouldn't have that same level of oversight. And again, that's my concerns around the model in and of itself. But maybe there's space for recommendation there, but it seems to be quite specific to the project, right? For councillors to decide. Did you want to come in on that?
We'll get to this later in the evening, but I'm just trying to find the number. It's not immediately in my head, this number. 7 point. Sorry, not 7, 8. So when we get into 8.1 and 8.18, the BCP Council has already agreed the concept of shareholder advisory boards and shareholder operations board. So the shareholder advisory board is a member entity supported by officers, and that I see that shareholder advisory board would be the body that gets more regular updates and perhaps assures cabinet or council that everything's okay. And if they are not assured of that, then they might take the view that more frequent reporting has to go to cabinet and council respectively. But fundamentally, the shareholder advisory board would be the point of which the council exercises more oversight of its companies.
I thought I definitely agreed with that recommendation for that. I think that will go a long way to helping with that. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. It's just a comment about arm's length bodies. Just because something is an arm's length body shouldn't mean that there should be less oversight, especially when it's funded by public money. I think we've talked about this before, about the tension of this being a company owned by the council, but it was funded, it was using public money. So I just wanted to ensure that was.
But presumably you want monitoring of what the council's getting for its investment, but not necessarily monitoring of the day-to-day operations in the way you would if it was in-house. I guess that's just a distinction I'm making. You wouldn't, you wouldn't, like A&G would want to know how's the loan going, how's the investment going, how's that going, but you wouldn't be asking, like, I want to hear from officers at a working level in the way we would for BCP officers. Does that make sense to you?
If I could just come in. So in October 24, so just over a year ago, Cabinet approved a new approach, I think, sort of based on the lessons here. So I think it'd be really helpful for the Audit Committee at some point in the future to explore how is this going on the companies that we've still got. How's the shareholder arrangements working, and have we learned the lessons? I think would be really helpful. But in terms of what should be the new approach, I think that's already been set out. I think that's and I can circulate the paper around again if that would be helpful.
Yeah, but I mean, I do completely agree. I think that the whole doing council work as an arm's length body, I'm dubious of the whole model to start off with. I'm just trying to be clear on what kind of, if you were going to try to make it work, what should you be doing? But yeah, as I say, I'm dubious about the.
Yeah, I think Councillor Armstrong sort of hit the nail on the head, really, in terms of if we've got those views, the fundamental question is, why do we want a company in the first place? Because if you want to exercise exactly the same control as a service, well, isn't it a service? And therefore, why make it something different?
No, you put that better than I was trying to, which is just, I'm trying to be understanding of what they wanted to achieve, but I've got this big question of why. The downsides of what they wanted to do are that reduced oversight, and I think, yeah, okay. We can, as I say, we can come back to any of this. Section 7. Should we pause there for a quick break, or should we try and do 10 more minutes and then take a break? Want to break now? Break now? Okay. To those joining online, we'll be back in at 8 o'clock. Welcome back, everyone joining us online. So we're picking up at, I believe, section 7, page 146 of 214, 124 of 190, whichever version you're looking at. So this is the section on the decision to close Future Places Limited. Again, I imagine the debate will be a little bit briefer than the previous sections, because a lot of this we've already touched on, but I think it's important to give the closure appropriate focus also. So I thought this section was very thorough in setting out some of the tensions that there clearly were between individuals involved at the time. I think it's clear that some in Future Places felt that there was I think, what's the phrase, a campaign of false narrative around how Future Places was characterised. And that there was criticisms of the DLUC external assurance paper for reflecting governance concerns, but maybe not being specific enough about what they were, such that it didn't read badly on Future Places. Again, that was an external review by DLUC, commissioned by DLUC. So you can kind of see that story of the narrative developing. And then there was the paper that came to Cabinet and the ONS meeting, and you can see that Future Places staff felt that it was biased against Future Places, or perhaps too negative. I thought it was relevant to highlight that this was not shared for everyone in Future Places. You can see from the board minutes, the Future Places board minutes, that the independent members said that they thought that the report to Cabinet was reasonably objective and did not contain slights on Future Places executives or undermine the company. But it was clear that some felt that it could be read to be critical, and I think it's fair to kind of make that clear. Did anyone want to come in on this? Any initial observations on this? I think I saw a quote in here about one of the Future Places employees feeling like it was not reflected that it was a thought leader, and kind of highlighting strengths of Future Places, whereas the BCP council narrative was a bit more perhaps a bit more critical of what had been seen before. And there was a concern from Future Places employees that councillors were not being given a completely a full picture of the benefits of Future Place, as well as some of the concerns that we're all aware of. And you can see why that would be. And then there was this question about whether or not to put forward a more tapered wind down of Future Places. So kind of close it as happened, but over a longer period of time, and whether that had sufficient discussion. I thought this was a very thorough section. I think it sets out kind of the different views held at the time. Shall we move on? I mean, I think it's kind of, it's to some extent inevitable that there was going to be some tension around the decision to close earlier than Future Places might have expected. So 7.2 is review the robustness of the process for determining what work was to be paid and what work was not paid for as part of the final settlement. So again, we talked about this in the previous discussion, and there was clearly a process went through around how much of the work in train to be paid for as potentially useful to the council, and how much not to be paid for. And I think it's a relevant point that's made in here that it was in the interest perhaps of Future Places to show a more positive position at the point of closure, but it was no matter to the council, because it was being paid for either way, as a write-off or as work paid for. So I did not have any concerns about that process of judging what work might have been useful, what work might not have been useful. you could probably argue that maybe it was too favourable to Future Places, or you could argue that it was not favourable enough to Future Places. But it seems a reasonable process was gone through for that, and certainly a substantial amount of work that was in train was paid for as potentially useful. But either way, no one at the council had any interest in overpaying or underpaying one way or the other from a financial perspective. Did anybody want to comment on that process? Nope. So then 7.3, set out the detail of the work paid for and not paid for. So again, it's really helpful to see this set out again. So there were subject matter experts who looked at it, and that could be delved into. We could ask some of those subject matter experts to comment on, well, how useful really was the work done in some of these projects. But I'm not sure that would be of any use, because it was a judgment made at the time with kind of little incentive one way or the other. And I suppose the nature of some of this work is that it's exploratory work. If it doesn't crystallize into a plan, that doesn't mean the work was valueless. So I think that is helpful and clear. Did anybody want to comment or look into a little bit more about that process and whether that was clear? I mean, my general reflection on the closure was, this is a big potential criticism of the current administration for taking the decision to close it and therefore have to write off most of that loan. And the argument would be, if it's seen it through for longer, it could have paid off and would have been been beneficial to the council long term. And that to my mind, that's a judgment, and that's a political judgment, and I don't think we would ever be able to kind of explore that in more detail. It's just a question on, it was a judgment made on what was available at the time. Councillor Talley.
I think it was a judgment made as well. The financial situation of the council at the time, we just burned through the majority of our reserves, and we're staring down the barrel of a potential Section 114. So in our whole cost-cutting exercise of this administration has been, to focus on delivering the basic services that we have to provide, and arm's length companies that are profligate with money. It was political, because this administration had a different view on how to generate revenue out of the assets that this council had. And that's not wrong. There's other councils have developed their assets and sold off, but sometimes it is. We've got a converted bus station that's now a retail park that famously lost a fair bit of money. So councils aren't always the best at doing this, and sometimes you need a regen company to do it, but not at a time when you've got you're down to your last few pennies in the piggy bank, really. And so yes, it cost money to do it, but it was I don't know, some passage in the Bible, I think you cut off your arm, don't you, to stop poking yourself in the eye or something like that. Not very good at my religious similes here.
I think that that's a fair point, that with any kind of with any asset closure, that you're accepting the loss of the potential benefit from retaining it, but you have to make that judgment call at the time. I don't see much in the way of further exploration in this area. Do any other councillors disagree? Okay, let's move on to section 8 then. Lessons learned update. So this sets out helpfully the work that has been done since the closure of Future Places. And I think it's worth noting that this is not the first. There has been quite a lot of lessons learned from Future Places already. I remember when we first started talking about this, last year, it was kind of pointed out that a lot of the lessons have already been learnt, but we felt the need to do that further deep dive. But you'll remember 2024, the paper came to us on lessons learnt, and I think we would probably all still agree with those findings. And then the shareholder operations board the recommendation for the shareholder operations board. I think again we spoke about previously about that, how that may have helped with some of those concerns about oversight you're talking about. So it's good to see that is now in the constitution as per 8.1.13. And the review of BCP council-owned companies, as the CEO noted to us. So now council-owned companies would not have councillors on the board in the way that Future Places initially had. That is now council policy, isn't it? But I think now might be a good point to ask officers to kind of comment on how progress is made on this lessons learnt, or do we need to do some further work? Come back to the committee on progress against this. Councillor Phipps.
Just a comment that a shareholder advisory board, which oversees council companies, doesn't seem to have met 8.1.12 at all this year. Doesn't meet very often. We still got councillors as directors on companies, directorships in council companies. So how are we overseeing these now? Because basically they've not met. So what's going on? With all of that, it doesn't seem quite right. I mean, I think we're saying, oh yeah, lessons learned and all this, the usual. But have we? Because what's happening? Can we get some comment on that, please?
CEO.
Yeah, if I could come in on that, thank you. So, as I mentioned, the last October 24, there was the paper approving the new shareholder governance, sort of highlighting some of the messages here. One of the important boards is the shareholder operations board that's met within the last 2 weeks. So that's an officer board. And this is kind of my sort of step in as part of my sort of new leadership, really wanting to sort of see and hear the lessons that we're hearing now and today, and to make sure that they're applied to all those other companies that we've got. So the shareholder operations board has met. We've started a stock take of where we are on each of our other wholly owned companies to make sure that they comply. I mentioned earlier about members, councillors being on boards. They're not. There are still a couple of companies with members on boards, and so we're sort of looking to implement that policy. But so as I'm getting a feel for and then a grip of the operations, once we've got that, then we'll move into the advisory board, which is where our politicians are. And then we'll get into the routine. But this is kind of one of the many things I'm looking at as I come in as new chief executive. But I think this series of work has been really, really helpful in highlighting the importance of those lessons for each of our wholly owned companies.
Thank you. And I do appreciate that for some of the more established companies which have had councillors on the board, it would be quite a change on the back of what happened with Future Places, for them to change that model. And so I think that hopefully this work really highlights some of the challenges that can come with that, and what needs to happen instead for a different kind of scrutiny. But I appreciate that it might be specific to the different council-owned companies and have different setups and different challenges. So perhaps we could have a report as a committee on progress against those previous lessons learned, and we can delve into that a bit more. Monitoring officer.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's also, I think, important to highlight in the background, as it were, Chief Executive and certainly the 4 colleagues here. You've got to be careful when you appoint somebody to a board to be a director, become a statutory director. So we don't also want to rush that process. They carry personal liability, and we have lots of ideas about how to prepare them, to train them, because you can get just as much as a muddle if you appoint councillors too quickly as you can do with officers. So, and I think that's really important in the background. So from my perspective, from the government side of it, just to make sure we're putting the right people in the right place, they understand their responsibilities and they're set up properly. So we're not setting up for fail or for liability. So things are happening, and we've we engaged a locum specialist company lawyer with huge amounts of local authority company law experience, and she's fantastic, helping us get the house in order, if you like, this side before we put major changes out. So just to reassure, there are things afoot.
Councillor Beasley.
Thank you, Chair. Well, just 2 points to make. I think the first is to be absolutely clear before any decisions are put in train. I would suggest that particularly those companies that were set up quite historically, that there is a proper understanding of why and how, because that is absolutely paramount. So I'll give you an example, but without too much detail for tonight's purposes. Seascape. Which I was instrumental in setting up. There are reasons for setting it up, and it's really important that it stays true to its objectives. And the objectives were very much around the housing function, particularly those that bridge the gap between the council, bed and breakfast, and all the rest of it. So I just think it's important to get that proper understanding. And secondly, that obviously, whatever decisions are made, they're not going to be made by me. Obviously, things have moved on, but the issue, I think, for us as audit and governance is concerned is that there is proper accountability, scrutiny, and challenge in the process. So if they are then determined to be just with officers on the board, then that function must come into play just as much as it would have done had it been councillors. And so I think the trick in this is to make sure that it is set up in that way so that we're not then, after the event, trying to establish the proper protocols to make it work and be accountable. And that should take a little bit of time. So Mr. Watson's obviously completely correct that one does need to take time over these changes, because you could easily find that we end up in a worse predicament than perhaps we have at the moment. Add one other thing, if I may, Chair, and that is that as far as the BDC is concerned, that is again an example of how its structure is quite different and was in fact the front runner in the country when it was first set up. So that structure needs to be recognised before any decisions are made as well.
So what is the process for making any changes to those? So, as audit and governance, we make a recommendation, based on future places, we think this is a principle. You're taking that away and working out what that means for those specific companies. Is there then a decision process, or is that something for the individual companies to work through? Or, how does that, when you do give us an update, what kind of update might that be?
Well, the companies remain legal entities on their own to be run obviously by shareholders with the directors doing the day-to-day operations. So there's a formal process at Companies House, but before that point, again, I think it's about what mechanism we use to select officers, their understanding of liability. I don't, it would probably be an officer decision. I don't think it would be necessarily anything different, but we'd have to caution that with where it would go if necessary. So probably not got that far yet, but I don't think it would be a complex decision. It would be notified most likely to Cabinet, but I don't think it would be necessarily a council decision. But of course, questions could be asked. So I don't know if that's answered your question.
No, that's helpful. I think that we want to make sure that we don't inadvertently mean that there's less oversight and by accident. So I think when we see that, you can talk us through what's instead of the council's role on the board, to give that assurance that the Councillor Phipps was talking about earlier. Did you indicate you wanted to come in, Councillor Armstrong, or not?
Thank you, Chair. It's just looking at one of the actions actually for 8.1.5, which refers to a 3.5, which is talking about action plans that are being developed in relation to each company to bring them in line with best practice and standards. Just wondering how far along we are with that. Is that what you're talking about, Aidan, that piece of work?
Yes, yes. There's and it's a careful piece of work. I think if I can sort of make a few points, Councillor Beasley is absolutely right that we need to remember and not lose sight of why the companies were set up in the first place. So we've seen an example with Future Places that was to set up a innovative company freed from the shackles of bureaucracy to go and flourish. That's kind of how it was kind of described in the first place, and we've seen what's happened. And as Councillor Beasley mentions, Seascape was set up for different purposes, and we've got Bournemouth Development Company, we've got Tricuro, and part of Tricuro as a care company's remit is to be the provider of last resort. So they've each got different reasons, so we need to be really mindful of that. I think there's a huge lesson that we've heard here today about getting, I use the phrase client side, the council's side right and proportionate. So sometimes you set up these businesses to go and flourish, but you need to have a proportionate level of governance and oversight. And some of that might be kind of pretty much daily contract management. Others might be a kind of an annual check-in, depending on the nature, the purpose and the risk associated with that business. So that's what we need to establish. So the paper approved last October by Cabinet says that councillors shouldn't be on the board, and we're so moving in that direction, but in a very careful way. And I think that's what we want to bring back to you. But I think one of the other big lessons is don't rush. I think that's that sense that through Future Places, it was done with huge ambition and huge pace, but it looks like corners were cut, and we don't want to do that as well. So we need to get things right. We need to do it properly, but in a measured and careful way, which reflects the risk appetite of the current administration. I think that's the other theme. It's about context of which we're operating in, and the financial climate and the current administration is more risk adverse, let me put it that way. So our action plan that we're developing is in that context.
Thank you, that's helpful. And I take on board the need for it to be done properly, and as long as it's done before the next council-owned company is set up, I guess, is the time limit for making sure that's in place. And I take the point about it being reflective of the risk appetite of the council, because a future set of councillors might be very, risk on, and take that different view again. But I'm quite keen to make sure that the council's processes are, restraining in that respect, and will slow that process down and make have greater challenge to doing things differently. Okay, so that's an action on the forward plan, is for something to come to us on progress against those previous lessons learned. Okay, shall we move on now to what to do? So this is there's different ways to manage this part of the conversation, and I know there's different views, and to date I've tried to toe that line between those who think we should do considerably more work and those who think we've already done more than we should. I'm trying to toe that line, and make sure that we do right by residents. So I think, so in my view, the current piece of work that has been done has been excellent, and a really incredible piece of work, and I think that needs to be commended. And I think I would ask other councillors if you agree, to sort of support my comments on our thanks for that. It's a huge undertaking, huge piece of work, very detailed, very thorough. There's very little you haven't been able to answer and our questions in any reasonable. So a huge thanks for that, and an acknowledgement of the work that's taken. I think it's been a really positive piece of work to have done in the interests of transparency for local government. Now, you said previously there were plans to put that on a landing page on the BCP website. So there's some sort of Future Places information repository. And I think that will be a really useful thing to do, to have that for residents if they ever want to understand more about what happened. So I don't think that's down as a formal recommendation, but is that something councillors would still agree with? Mr. Stannard?
I think, excuse me, it's on our Audit and Governance Committee action tracker to do that. I think the timing of that is crucial, and whether now is the right time or whether it's at the very end of the process once you've got, if you choose other avenues. So I think you might have to decide
When?
on that, when
No, that's fair.
that's suitable.
But I know other councillors want to come in, so just to set out my thinking, I've tried to abide by the guidance on public inquiries and public investigations and how they should proceed, and I'm very mindful of the report referencing individuals, and so I think it's important that we give individuals an opportunity to comment for themselves on some of the information contained. So I think, irrespective of whether you think more work is needed, I think there's a good case for writing by email to a number of stakeholders involved and giving them the opportunity to comment. And part of that, I would ask specific questions to make it easier for them and for us. So I think that should be the next stage that we do, is we go out and ask direct questions of the individuals involved and allow that opportunity to provide comment. So my thinking is that we shouldn't call this report final until we can publish it as a final paper, accompanied by this by additional information received. So my thinking is that there'd be a sort of wraparound note with a brief introduction on this is what the committee did, and asks for, this is the internal audit report and some supplementary information received since then. I'll pause there to see councillors whether or not you're on board so far. Councillor Tarling.
Yeah, by going out to, are we talking about people that are either named or referenced or implicated by the report, giving them a right to reply and publishing those statements as part of the, if we're going to upload this into a public forum, giving them a right to reply? Because it's sort of quasi-legal type position. I'd want to seek some legal advice on, how much we would publish of a third party's view. I think, if an individual's named in the report, I think as a responsible local authority, we have to give them some right to reply. But whether we take that on board or not, I don't know, because I think we're straying into some sort of legal swamp at the moment with this.
No, I think this is something that I have been conscious of sort of from early on, that we would need to make sure that we're following that guidance. I mean, I have taken legal advice from our monitoring officer to date, but I think we will have him look at what we propose to send out, and that plan. I suspect that we will need to take a decision on exactly what gets into that published form, having seen the responses. It may very well be that nobody responds. But I think the right thing to do is to make contact where we can, with a wide range of individuals, and then the public can see the draft, the internal audit report, accompanied by any further clarifications that people want to give. So I think nearer the time, we will make sure that there is legal advice on what is published. But I think that still means that that doesn't change the next steps, is asking the questions. So I think if we're doing that, then that allows us to explore in more detail some of the areas that we've flagged as of particular interest as we've gone through. So it's kind of no resource burden to explore some of these further lines of inquiry. So as we've gone through, I've been making notes, as I know that Democratic Services have, of where we've flagged that we'd like to know a bit more. Let's hear from the person involved on that. There's a number of comments where I said this person asserts this about this person. Well, the obvious thing to do is let's ask the person noted to give their view. So I'm anticipating a list. I have a list that I've pulled together. I asked members if they would like to add to that with any questions of their own. As of earlier today, I hadn't received any, so I haven't circulated my list. But as of earlier today, when I set off, and but I'm aware that councillors do have questions. So if they send them, then we can get them sent out, and I'll make sure all councillors see that list before it goes out. So I was imagining if we aim to send these questions out next week with a deadline for January, that would allow a reasonable time for it to come to an early ear. Well, it's with people for a good month. But I'm open-minded to that. I want to keep the pace up, because I don't want anything to hold back us making progress with getting this agreed, finalised, and the recommendations to full council. So so my thinking is that if we go out next week to individuals with our questions, give them to a time in January, and then aim to get it on an A&G agenda soon after that as feasible. Again, I'll pause there to see if anybody has any comments. I see the monitoring officer wants to come in there.
Thank you, Chair. It was just maybe helpful, rather than having to sort of mark homework and send it back, as it were, that members are aware of the two principles that you can have in mind when you think about questions and who to. One is the principle that it will be fair and proper for anyone who's going to be criticised or could be deemed to be criticised to have a right of reply. These are very much more public inquiry principles, but in theory we can follow the same natural justice thread, if you like. So one is the right of response. The second is the danger of self-incrimination. And you have to put yourself, I think, in the position of the person you're asking the question to, some of which may be working now, some of which may be regulated professions, and the opportunity for them to think about what it is they're going to respond with, and they may need to take legal advice upon it. So without sort of guiding you too much down the garden path, I think you need to be very careful how you phrase the question. Two principles that will be in my mind advising the council, who we have to protect from claims and potential adverse publicity. So if that gives you a flavour into part of the advice I'm given to the chair, which is shared there, they're two principles that you should really have in mind as you progress from here.
So the way I envisage it is, if we have a list of questions, I will circulate it to committee members, and you can give your advice on the phrasing of them, and members can consider whether they'd like to add to that, and then they can go out to the individuals promptly. Again, with the caveat, individuals are under no obligation to respond. We may want to take a view if some individuals do want to respond but need a bit longer. We could take a view on that also. But obviously not wanting to hold things up too much. But do committee members have a view on whether sort of mid-January is appropriate? Yeah, take that as tacit consent.
I don't know. Don't all the law firms get really busy with divorces around Christmas? I mean, I don't know. There might be a flippant point, but if it is like Robin says, with getting an appointment and the back and forth and that sort of thing, I think so to kind of set that as a aim for this date, but consider a reasonable, if people have got a reasonable look. I've got this in train and I'm waiting for this, that, and the other.
We can take a view on that at the time. Councillor Darling.
Yeah, I'm more conscious of the right to reply than the right of us to ask questions. I think the right of us to ask questions, we've got a report, we've asked the questions, a report's been generated on the basis of that. As I understand it, you're asking individual council members of this committee to say, is there a question you want to ask of a certain individual that may or may not be named on here? I think that's stretching the remit somewhat of our investigation. And I think a general right of reply is as our monitoring officer just said, is only sort of natural justice, and I agree with that. But I'm slightly cagey. I'm glad that you said that all questions would go through our monitoring officer or our legal team, of whoever that might be. But I'm slightly concerned that we are extending our investigation by doing this, and I wouldn't want to then open up another can. You know, nothing so far that I've seen in this report has said that there's anything that personally I think we need to dig deeper in, or that there may be other stuff that we can find, but I don't think we're going to find the smoking gun here. I think it's a case of us just getting to the point of taking on board the lessons learned, the recommendations, doing the right to reply, and moving on. I've heard other councillors, members of this committee, raise questions, and the questions that we've asked tonight have been the same questions we've asked all along. We aren't going into new ground. We are sort of just going over it again, and we need to come to an end with this, because if you look around, all the people involved in this meeting today, those online, those that aren't involved here, if you were to put a cost against us, I know we're already paid for as members of the committee, but our officers here are on overtime, I'm sure. I won't go too deep into that one. I haven't looked at the pay and rewards yet. But there is a cost associated with this, and it might not be like the COVID inquiry. We might not be up to the 200 million figure, but we are incurring costs every time we have a meeting here. So I want to see the end of this.
I appreciate that, and I take that on board, and I recognise that we have a very split committee on this. So this is my proposal as a first step that I hope we can all agree on as a compromise, because I think that if we are going out to people anyway, as part of a natural justice exercise, we may very easily, and at a very low resource, add a few more questions that could add a little bit more colour to some of the areas that we have been exploring. And I think there are reasonable grounds on some of the issues, whether there's been accusations made or whether there's been allegations. I don't think it's unreasonable to say, well, is this true, for example, or do you have any comments on this part of the report? It's no resource cost. None of this will sit with internal audit, which I think is very, very important. It's a simple question that can, hopefully we can kind of compromise on this as a next step, which is valuable for meeting two objectives there. So then I hope that we can be in a position to publish the final report, which is this report, with additional information received, and at that point that can be made the final report, and the recommendations can go to cabinet. Now what I'd like agreement on that as a plan of action, kind of parked, and then we can have a conversation about whether or not to do additional work, on top of that. But can we get kind of agreement on that as a compromise next step? I'm not sure whose hand went up first. Did you want, Councillor Tarling? Did you want to? Oh, Councillor Beasley.
I can be quite brief. Just on the right to reply, if we do get statements back, and we've all been contacted by individuals that have been involved in this Future Places investigation via email that haven't been represented in this meeting. And I've made a point of not replying, but I do read the emails. I think I replied once and said I do read your emails, but I'm not replying to them because this is the forum in which the discussion should happen, in a public forum. However, if we had statements in from certain individuals and we decided that for whatever commercial sensitivity reason or legal privilege that we decided not to publish them, would that individual then say, well, hang on, I've given you a statement, you haven't published it, therefore you aren't giving me the right to reply? Or vice versa, we need to make sure that that reply doesn't then come up with further legal implications. And I'm sure the monitoring officer is aware of this, and our legal team, but I'm just wondering what happens if we get into that scenario where somebody says, well, you had a right to reply and you didn't publish my views.
So to be clear, the guidance on public inquiries does not specify that rights of reply responses need to be incorporated in the final report. Right. They need to have that opportunity to feed in, and I would hope that for the most part it would be directly published, but we'll take legal advice as appropriate for that. But that's, yeah.
So in that case, thank you very much for that explanation. That's great. Can we make sure when we go out to those individuals that we do actually put that codicil in there that best efforts, we will review it and make all efforts to publish. But if there's some reason, either some sort of legal privilege or commercial confidentiality, that we may redact or not include their comments. Thank you.
Exactly. I completely take on board the importance of legal advice throughout, but I don't think that should hold us back from asking reasonable questions from those who I imagine will want an opportunity to have input. And I certainly would take the view that I would encourage as much as possible. You know, like we've taken with this whole report, there has to be very, very good grounds for it not being published. And I think I have to. That's another thing I did want to commend Mr. Stannard for the minimum amount of confidential and the excluded information. It's minimal in a huge report, and I think that's to the benefit of the public. So, Councillor Beasley, I believe you wanted to come in.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Well, I think I would like to state that I'm supportive of the content of your action plan put out by email to members of the committee on the 1st of December, and I think that's what you've been covering now. I'm happy with the timescales. As you know, because we've spoken about it, I'm very keen that the opportunity is afforded to members of the committee to put those questions through the process you've set out. I think that's quite important because most of them, I suspect, will be subsets, if you like, of items that have been covered where there's a slight doubt as to what is meant or what is actually concluded from it. So I don't think we're looking at anything that's going to change the world, but I think it is about the technical degree of accuracy that I believe to be very important. Two questions which I think probably should be directed to Mr. Stannard as the author of the report. The first is, I suspect that some submissions have been made which are perhaps outside or after the reports that we have seen made by interested parties, and that those will be taken into account. They don't need to be rehearsed again by the same people if they haven't been included already, would be my first question. And my second question concerns the sub-questions at D, the scope sub-questions appendix, which are the items that are through there in red. I just wanted to determine with Mr. Stannard what the status of those is. Are they items which I think my reading is that Mr. Stannard's looking for further clarification over, or are they there as, if you like, a reminder to us that there are some other issues that might need to be looked at? So those are my two fundamental questions. Thank you, Chair.
If I could come in on the first one, I think this proposal is not from Mr. Stannard, so he might not have a view on that. My presumption would be that we go back to the people who have been in touch and make sure that it's consistent across everyone being asked. So they're all being asked similar questions, similar time frame, and I would hope that wouldn't be too burdensome on those. But I think bringing it together into a consistent format and style would help. I mean, I have had many emails, and I think distilling it into what key messages do you want to include here, I think would be a useful exercise. But don't let me speak for you there if you wanted to add on that.
Sorry, no, I don't particularly want to expand on that. Can I just go to Councillor Beasley's second point about the Reds? So obviously the Reds comments were almost aide-memoirs because various people are asked various questions that were tentatively linked, and we tried to link them to the scope items. Now, I perceive that the vast majority of those have been answered. Yes, there are several where they're not specific, but they weren't a question that the committee wanted. They were questions that somebody else wanted. So whether you as a committee want those answered, that's up to you. But they weren't your original question. So again, I wasn't sort of seeing my role to answer every single question that anybody and everybody asked. And then finally, I think I don't see my report now is my report because it covers my role in the investigation. This is it. So any subsequent comments from individuals would be incorporated into a final covering report, you know, a committee report, rather than be sort of retrospectively put into my report. So that's how I'm seeing it.
Thank you. Did that answer your questions?
Yes, but it does raise one issue that was looking a bit further that I think the Stanard's opened up on. So what we've seen so far is effectively all the background that you're going to use when you do your final report, which is the one that will have recommendations attached to it, so that when Audit and Governance get that back, we can agree that. Is that broadly what you're saying? Through you, Chair.
Sorry, no, because I think I've already done my recommendations. Now, if anything further crops up, they're almost the committee's recommendations, or the chairs, or whoever's, you know, however that might transpire through. So I don't see necessarily that to be my role to put that final report together.
So I think you could bring there could be a very simple, almost one-page cover note, which is attached is my draft report, with our wraparound note that we'll work on with the responses, and just list the recommendations, and that's that's kind of it. But there's no further work planned for internal audit at this stage. It's just a kind of an opening summary for the public, and then the additional information received with it. Does that? Can you
Well, I think it is, Chair. I just want to be sure that this is when we completely wrap this up, in whichever way that is done. I mean, obviously, Mr. Watson and other officers will have thoughts of their own on that as to how it should be done, but it needs to be consistent with council processes and procedures. And I just want to be sure that we're not getting out of that, because that would be a pretty basic mistake to make.
I agree. I think you would present a very simple cover note in the same template for all reports, saying attached is the internal audit final report, which is your part plus our bit, and these are the recommendations to put to cabinet and then full council. So it's literally no more than that, but it's still in the same. We're making A&G are making a series of recommendations to cabinet on the back of that. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it? It's making sure that it's still in line with those processes.
Absolutely, and obviously, I suppose the ultimate arbiter of that is Mr. Watson in his role. But I just wanted to be sure that we were focused on that as a committee, and we didn't go out here tonight thinking something different.
No, agree. And I think it's important that the recommendations go to cabinet, or cabinet then council. But once we've seen the responses we've had from people, in case there's anything that comes out of those that makes us want to adjust the recommendations, that seems straightforward to me. I expect it's likely we'll approve all of these, but we may consider further. So we should allow for that possibility. Councillor Tully.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Councillor Beasley. I think you sort of summarised it completely, and I can see the light at the end of the tunnel now. I think it's quite important as well on the recommendations that we almost draw another column in there. So I noticed there's a list of recommendations and who the owner should be, but we need that when, by thing, and that's not necessarily for us to fill out. That might be cabinet that decide to put the when in, or the response from cabinet. Cabinet may decide not to accept some of these recommendations. So we need to give an opportunity there for the feedback from cabinet after seeing the report, and maybe a thing in there says, so cabinet's response and so on. So just to say that when we know it's closed out, so on any action, as an action, if the recommendations become an action tracker, that we've actually got the closeout mechanism for those actions as well shown in there, because I think that's quite important. It helps cabinet say, well, this is what we're going to do. I know we shouldn't direct them, but it does make it easier for us.
I think I would just add to that when I last spoke to the external auditor, he said that he was very supportive of the recommendations, and he encouraged us to make sure that we're seeing that tracked and the management plan on the back of them. I don't know if it would be appropriate to see that management plan at that point in time, but it may be that in making the recommendations to Cabinet, there's a little bit more information on progress made or how you would go about tackling the recommendation that could be provided at that point. But I don't feel strongly about that, as long as we as a committee are aware of the need to track them. Mr. Salmon.
Can I make one last point, because I don't think I addressed one of Councillor Beasley's points. Where I've received past information from various people, I've made a judgment on whether the relevance of that information specific to the scope that you as a committee came up with, and some information that I've been provided me is not it didn't meet any of the scope areas. So it might be that you have to consider whether you want to receive that information, you know, because is the open question, and by the way, is there anything additional you want to make, or is it very specific on the scope items you're, because you know, there is information that people have supplied which is not covered at all in this report.
I think that's helpful, and I think you're right. I mean, that people can go into huge amounts of detail on various areas. That this is one of the reasons why I'm quite keen to keep it focused on specific questions, to try to kind of make it useful and readable for the public and for us, and try and kind of contain that to what we think is needed. But again and again, I'm quite keen for this to go through the monitoring officer. So I think we will stick to the plan there. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And it was always difficult to predict the outcome until we'd finished this particular meeting. I think on my mind, constitutionally, picking up what Councillor Beasley says, is what is the process from here. So in my mind, is you have received a report from Mr. Stannard, which contains his recommendations. And I think the question is whether or not the committee accepts those recommendations as they are. So although you may not be closing down the report and putting it away as such, you are formally agreeing as a committee that you accept those recommendations. They are minuted. Part two, which I think we're moving on to, is whether or not there are other recommendations to come, but you can't get to them yet because you need to ask more questions. So my one concern is, I think, if you think of decision making, that can sometimes be challenged, that the first question usually is, well, who made the decision? So the decision to instruct Mr. Stannard was the committee. It's not Mr. Stannard's decision to then go out to ask further questions to make further recommendations. So I think it is important that I advise the committee to at least consider formally accepting the recommendations, if not the whole report just yet. So we close that down. Mr. Stannard isn't asked to make any further recommendations, and then the committee then goes off with these questions, etc., identifies people. I think that is a constitutional way to make sure that decision-making process is marked off accordingly. That would be my.
I'm not against that, and I am not aware of anyone disagreeing with any of the recommendations, but I do think we should have that capacity to add to them before putting the recommendation to Cabinet. It seems a bit unwieldy to me to send these to Cabinet and then potentially another bunch with the final report. So can we make a sort of in principle decision to accept these recommendations, but we're not going to make the recommendations until after we've finalised the report with the supplementary information, and then consider if we want any more recommendations, and then the paper goes to Cabinet and we can say here's all the recommendations, here's the whole report, and extra information at that point. So is that something that we can do? Should we agree that that now? So that's that in principle on these recommendations, but with that caveat, and then we can kind of that doesn't stop. But yeah.
I'm noting these as a series of actions.
Okay.
Are you happy with that?
Yeah. Series of actions.
You're not actually, you don't seem to be resolving anything
Do we want to resolve to just to agree them in principle? No, no, you're happy with the plan to just keep it as an action, and then when we get.
I would dearly love a resolution that brings the guillotine down on this tonight, but you've just said you want to incorporate these questions and the last set of comments from members of this committee. So you can't sort of do one without the other. So the last thing we do is the recommendations.
Yeah.
So after January, our next meeting after January, we then say, right, these are the 20 recommendations. We then may modify them in that period. We may take on board some additional comments, and then that becomes not Mr. Stannard's report, it becomes the committee's paper to cabinet. And it needn't be a fancy report. It is literally the A&G recommends to cabinet this list of recommendations, and they might be word for word exactly as in Mr. Stannard's report, or they might be slightly modified, or they might be added to, or some we may not agree to. But that's really the next meeting after January, after we've done. That's the last thing I think to go forward. But
so you can make that in the minutes. We all provisionally agree with the recommendations and plan to make them, but we'll see. Okay, Councillor Armstrong.
No, I'd like it recorded that I don't agree to that because we're not quite fully putting this to bed, and there might be other issues that crop up that need to be considered in those recommendations. So I'd just like it noted that
Fine.
I don't agree
It doesn't have to
that.
be. It doesn't have to be in the
we
minutes.
We can't formalise a list of recommendations until we've completed and formalised the piece of work.
I don't think we're on a different page on this. I think we all agree we're not, as it stands, we're not unhappy with these recommendations, and we expect to make them, but with that caveat that we're going to get further information, so we're not formally signing that off. Fine. Councillor Phipps.
Do we want to put the word in somewhere interim then? This isn't the final, is it?
Well, I sort of suggested in principle, but I'm not going to die in a ditch on it, because if we don't need a vote, we'll have the vote when we have the full list. Let's just do that at the next meeting. Okay. So anything else on? So that's the immediate next steps, is to send me your ideas for questions, and I will circulate it. We'll get the monitoring officer to look at it and consider the right codices, etc. And we can do that. So then I think we will work on pulling them together into this wraparound report once we've received a response. And I hope you can trust that I would make sure that you're very well cited and involved in that process. I don't think we need a live in public drafting meeting, but I think we can be collaborative in that approach. And then that's what comes to that meeting. Councillor Armstrong.
I'll be really careful about what I say here, but I think that our residents would also want to see the consequences if there has been, I say if there has been, or if there is the possibility of any wrongdoing whatsoever, and I'm not suggesting that there is. I think people do need to be held to account, and we can't eliminate that as an option or a possibility or a recommendation in some way. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for noting that. So I suppose that there's the possibility we could invite people to attend that meeting if they wanted to expand on their answers. That's something we could consider. I imagine there's mixed views on that near the time, but again, maybe we can take that judgment once we see what the response and the level of interest is in the answers. And I think we'd want to be balanced if we did that. So we could take a view on that, but that's not something I'm closed-minded about. But we can't summon people. Okay, so that I think is helpful. So that is going to go on an agenda of a future meeting, subject to the responses received and pulling that together. in terms of a forward introduction as part of this wraparound, I imagined it would be useful for readers to have some sort of high level summary at the start for what is this audit and governance called for this, and this is what's attached. I don't think it would be a good idea to sort of write something from the committee and have us all agree every word, but I'm open-minded as to the form of that. I'm happy for it to be some sort of short message from the chair, and I can note in that I'm not speaking on behalf of others. I'd be happy if other members wanted to have their kind of wanted to make a written statement as part of it as well. Basically, I don't want strong feelings about how that reads to derail the general purpose of it, which is to inform readability. But happy to discuss that nearer the time. You can make a decision as and when you see a draft. Is that something that you, Councillor Beasley?
It's your prerogative as chair to do that, and I think it would be wise, as you suggested, if you brought a draft to the committee. In my experience of other similar circumstances, not of this scale, that would be the normal process, and I think it's very unlikely that it will be that members will want to change it very much, actually, if at all.
Thank you. Again, I don't have a particular agenda on this other than just to make it an accessible document and give some sort of introduction. But again, let's we can agree that between ourselves at that meeting. Okay, so I think we are agreed broadly on the way forward, with the question as to any extra pieces of work or lines of inquiry or any other things that we wish to discuss. It may very well be that the best course of action is to, at that point in time, having seen that additional information, where we've got questions for ourselves, it may be that, well, let's ask the people who were there, see what they say. And then if we think, having seen that we think, well, I'm not sure, that might be the time at which to decide on anything further, and that could be put to a vote. What do members think on that? That strikes me as kind of in the same way we're not recommending the recommendations yet. It strikes me that we wouldn't agree extra work before doing that, but happy to discuss. Again, as chair, I'm not against doing external work, and will facilitate the making of a vote on that happen. Councillor Tully.
Sorry, Councillor Waite just said something quite funny. You're in danger of getting into Sir Humphrey territory there, I think, with trying to explain an explanation and the previous explanation you just made. So I think we all understand what you've said now in your summing up. I don't think it's worth adding any more to it. I think you're there.
Are you accusing me of being too verbose there?
No, well, I can't do that. Surely I can't do that. Maybe the pot kettle black. Absolutely.
I'm just trying to be.
But I do think you've sort of done it now, and I think each time you go and re-explain it, we end up getting further away from your original explanation 10 minutes ago, which is actually very good.
I appreciate that. I'm just conscious that there are members of the committee who have, different views on this, and I in no way want to shut that down. And I in no way want to make it difficult to put forward some proposals there. I think that as of earlier today, I haven't been sent specific questions around that. I think to take some of that forward, we need to have some specific. Like this is what we want to explore. This is what we want to get quotes. This is the that's that line of inquiry, and I'm happy to collaborate on that. But is that something that you wanted to put forward now or to discuss now, or is that something, do you agree with the principle of let's get the answers back first? If any councillors wanted to come in, yeah, Councillor Armstrong.
Yeah, only one thing to say is that I have emailed you today with quite a few bits of information, including just to pick up on Councillor Beasley's point with regards to the scope, the additional the red bits that were in the report. So I have gone through and highlighted parts of that that I'm still not clear on, or don't feel personally that I've received that assurance regarding, that weren't actually included in the original, in the scope that was agreed. And I have started some work on asking some questions, so which I would like to go into the final list of questions. So I just wanted that noted. Thank you.
No, and to be clear, I'm referring to earlier today. I saw that you sent an email. I saw it after arriving here when I logged on for this meeting. So I'm grateful for that and for sending questions through. And I'm aware that other councillors have some questions they want to add as well. And I'm again, as chair, I see my role as facilitating, kind of bringing a proposal that we can vote on and make decisions on. So I'm happy to be involved in that. But as far as I'm concerned, the role of internal audit is done. It's on the committee now. And I want to thank you again for your considerable time and effort so far. Should we leave it there? Is there anything else anyone wanted to say to before we conclude this? All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining online.